Hey everyone! Tonight we are diving into a story so audacious, so contrary to the history you thought you knew, that it genuinely feels like something out of a blockbuster movie. Tonight, we're going to explore the life of a single, incredible woman who stood against the colossal greed of the early European maritime powers, commanded a sophisticated fleet in combat, and effectively dictated international policy while her contemporaries in places like England and Holland couldn't even legally sign a contract or own the clothes on their backs. You are transported back to the early 17th century. Forget the stale, dusty maps showing the globe neatly divided by emerging empires. You are standing on the humid shores of the Malay archipelago. The air is thick with the scent of cloves, nutmeg, and pepper, the very commodities that fueled global commerce and ignited half a dozen wars. You look out over a vast sapphire sea that is less a peaceful highway and more a liquid battlefield. Every sail you see, every shadow on the horizon, represents staggering wealth or impending violence. The sheer scale of the trade here, the constant, brutal competition for control over these spices, is almost incomprehensible. You probably wouldn't survive a week navigating these waters without either being scanged, starving, or catching a disease that turns your skin green. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please let me know your location and the local time down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You feel the heat radiating off the white sand beach. The year is approximately 1600. The geopolitical map of Southeast Asia is a patchwork quilt of thriving, independent sultanates. This isn't an empty periphery waiting to be colonized. This is the wealthy center of the world. But change is coming, carried on the massive square sails of European ships. The Portuguese arrived first, carving out a brutal presence in places like Malacca. Now, the new contenders, the Dutch, are beginning to assert their staggering financial and military might through the Verenigd Oostindische Company, or the VOC, Dutch East India Company. This wasn't just a trading company. It was a sovereign entity, authorized by the Dutch government to wage war, sign treaties, mint currency, and execute its own citizens. It was, arguably, the world's first and most ruthless megacorporation, and its eyes were fixed squarely on the profits of the archipelago. Your focus narrows onto the powerful sultanates of the Indonesian islands, specifically the thriving militant states of Java and Sumatra. But tonight, we turn our attention specifically to the Sultanate of Usa, located on the northern tip of Sumatra. Usa, which sits perfectly positioned at the mouth of the strategically critical Malacca Strait, was an economic behemoth. Any ship carrying wealth, whether spices to the west or silks and porcelain to the east, had to pass through Usa's sphere of influence. This gave the Sultanate immense power, a power they wielded not through passive collection of taxes, but through active and often aggressive naval dominance. Isa was rich, proud, and armed to the teeth, which is a mainstream historical fact, often overlooked by histories that focus solely on European expansion. They were a sophisticated state, with diplomatic ties stretching to the Ottoman Empire and complex legal systems, not a primitive kingdom waiting to be discovered. The sultans of Esa understood that controlling the sea meant controlling the world's wealth, and they invested heavily in their fleet, building specialized ships and maintaining well-trained armies. This brings us to a crucial, quirky tidbit. Unlike many neighboring states, Esa had a long tradition of female political influence and even military involvement. While the court was predominantly male, high-born women were not relegated to the back rooms. They were educated in statecraft, rhetoric, and sometimes even military theory. A stark contrast to the European aristocracy, where a woman's power was almost entirely derivative of her husband or father. This environment is where our hero, Malahayati, would eventually step onto the stage. However, the sheer size and constant pressure of the VOC meant that diplomacy was failing. The Dutch demand for a complete aggressive monopoly, the right to buy low and sell high without any local competition, was fundamentally incompatible with Usa's desire to maintain its sovereignty and control its own trade. Historians still argue whether the Dutch truly believed they could achieve their aims without full-scale war, or if their initial trading expeditions were simply reconnaissance missions disguised as commerce. What is certain is that the clash of these two monolithic forces is as Anese sovereignty and VOC corporatism was inevitable, and when it came, it would be a clash of galleys, cannons, and sheer willpower, with a woman at the very center of the storm. As you watch the Asanis flags snap in the tropical breeze, you realize the stage is set, not for a subtle diplomatic dance, but for a brutal high-stakes fight for economic survival commanded by a leader history should remember better than it does. You are now sailing north, following the coastline of Sumatra, and the majesty of the Sultanate of Aceh comes into sharp focus. This was no peripheral trading post. This was the recognized global hub for pepper and spices, often referred to by Europeans as the Porch of Mecca due to its religious importance and its role as the staging post for pilgrims heading to Arabia. Forget your preconceptions of disorganized, tropical kingdoms. Aceh was a highly sophisticated, bureaucratic state whose reach extended beyond Sumatra to the Malay Peninsula and parts of Borneo. It maintained formal diplomatic relations with major global powers, including a very famous exchange of letters, and envoys with the Ottoman Sultanate, Murad III, seeking support against the growing Portuguese menace. This connection underscores a crucial mainstream historical fact. The wars fought in Southeast Asia were not isolated incidents, but part of a global geopolitical conflict involving European, Middle Eastern, and Asian powers. The Asanis capital, situated strategically near the northern tip of the island, was a bustling cosmopolitan city. You walk through its markets and hear not only various local dialects but also the chatter of Gujarati, Persian, Arabic, and even Portuguese merchants, all vying for favorable trade deals. The city's wealth was built on its strategic advantage. By controlling the Malacca Strait, ESA could tax, regulate, or even completely shut down traffic between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. If you wanted to get your pepper, you paid ESA, simple as that. They didn't just let ships sail through. They enforced their territorial waters with a disciplined navy, which brings us closer to Malahayati. The Sultanate's military structure was impressively modernized for its time. They imported high-quality cannons and firearms from the Ottomans, who were keenly interested in using ESA as a proxy to check Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean. This willingness to adopt and integrate foreign military technology, fascinating. Quirky tidbit meant that Asanis warships, though often smaller and faster than the European galleons, were equally well armed, particularly with artillery and gunpowder weapons. The Sultan of Aceh maintained a standing army and a permanent navy, unlike some kingdoms that relied on temporary levies. This professionalism allowed for the detailed training and strategic thinking that would eventually produce commanders like Hayati. Asanis society, though governed by Islamic law, provided unusual latitude for women in certain high-status roles, especially within the aristocracy. While property and legal rights were far more restricted than they are today, the concept of a woman holding significant political and even military influence was not inherently scandalous, provided she belonged to the ruling elite. This cultural foundation would be critical for Hayati's later success. Historians still argue whether the succession of 4 female sultans in the 17th century, starting just after Hayati's primary period of command, was a deliberate political strategy to stabilize the court, or if it was simply the result of a lack of suitable male heirs. Regardless, the acceptance of female leadership was clearly established. The Sultanate's strength was not solely dependent on its military hardware. It also relied on intelligence and diplomacy. You watch as Asanis envoys return from far-flung courts, bringing back detailed reports on European naval doctrine, weaponry, and, crucially, their internal rivalries. The Asanis court was adept at playing the various European powers, Portuguese, Dutch, and English, against each other, offering exclusive trading rights to one faction in exchange for military aid against another. It was a complex, multi-layered game of power politics, and Aceh was a master player. I mean, imagine today trying to play Apple, Google, and Amazon off against each other to secure a monopoly on, well, everything. That's the level of corporate and political maneuvering going on here. But the real threat was always the VOC. Unlike the Portuguese, who focused on strategic ports, the Dutch were obsessed with controlling the supply of spices from the source. They didn't just want to participate in the trade, they wanted to eliminate all competitors, including the Asanis themselves. This drive for monopoly, backed by the VOC's enormous share capital, far exceeding that of any European nation-state at the time, created an existential threat that the Asanis were forced to meet with maximum force. It is into this atmosphere of high finance, sophisticated diplomacy, and latent violence that Malahayati, a woman who would soon command the fate of the state, was born. She wasn't just some talented general who popped up out of nowhere. She was a product of the Asanis elite, forged by a powerful cosmopolitan state, ready to defend its place in the world. You can sense the tension in the air, the kind that precedes a massive storm, where every political decision is a gamble, and every naval patrol is a potential spark for full-scale war. And soon, this entire complex apparatus will need to rely on the strategic mind of a woman whose legacy far overshadows her historical recognition in the West. The air cools slightly as you leave the bustling harbor. Moving into the private aristocratic compounds where the ruling elite of Aceh lived and governed, this is where Malahayati was born, likely sometime in the mid-16th century, though precise dates can be frustratingly elusive in pre-modern Southeast Asian history. She wasn't born into just any wealthy family. Her lineage was deeply embedded in the Asanis royal court and military structure. Her grandfather was said to be an admiral, and her father held a key position as a naval commander or port official. This ancestry is a crucial mainstream historical fact. Hayati inherited not only high status but also a profound, intimate knowledge of naval affairs and strategy from her family. Imagine her childhood. Instead of the gentle, constrained upbringing often expected of European noblewomen, Hayati's youth was steeped in the language of the sea, politics, and war. Her education wasn't focused on embroidery and polite conversation. It was rigorous, encompassing religion, literature, and, most importantly, statecraft and military theory. You might see her in the inner courtyards, not just reading poetry, but reviewing detailed charts of the Malacca Strait, learning about currents, tides, and the optimal deployment of different ship types. The Asanis elite knew that military prowess was the ultimate guarantor of their economic prosperity, and they invested in training their children, including daughters, who showed aptitude. This aristocratic education meant she was taught to think strategically and critically. She understood the complexities of the spice trade, not just as a consumer of luxury, but as a system of tariffs, monopolies, and logistical nightmares. She knew the capabilities and vulnerabilities of the massive Portuguese naws and the increasingly dangerous Dutch flyboats. This technical knowledge, passed down through her naval family, allowed her to later command with authority, instantly recognizable as someone who understood the mechanics of warfare. This is an important, quirky tidbit, as it completely demolishes the idea of a female commander in the 16th century being an accidental figure. Hayati was specifically groomed for a role of consequence, even if her ultimate position as admiral was unforeseen. The capital city was situated far enough inland to be defensible, yet close enough to the sea to be the naval nerve center. You can picture young Hayati visiting the shipyards, the smell of fresh-cut tropical timber and pitch heavy in the air. She would have watched the construction of the large fast galleys, the backbone of the Asanis fleetups, observing how the master builders incorporated Portuguese and Ottoman designs while maintaining the maneuverability required in the shallow, tricky waters of the archipelago. Learning shipbuilding was akin to learning modern aerospace engineering. It was the ultimate high-tech knowledge of the era. The Sultanate's governance was often decentralized, with various powerful families controlling aspects of trade and defense. This environment fostered a competitive spirit among the elite, ensuring that the best minds, regardless of gender, were often pushed to the fore. In Asanis court politics, competence was often prized over mere birthright, particularly when the survival of the state was at stake. Historians still argue whether Hayati's education in naval strategy was unique among Asanis women of her rank, or if it was common practice among families with strong maritime traditions. What is clear is that her subsequent success paved the way for the later era of female sultans, demonstrating the cultural acceptance of female leadership at the highest levels of the state. It's an interesting contrast. While European philosophers debated whether women had souls capable of rational thought, Malahayati was mastering cannon placement and fleet maneuvers. Her early life was not just about books and lectures. It was about living in a constant state of readiness. The Portuguese were a perpetual threat, launching sporadic raids and attempting to disrupt Asanis shipping. Every few years, there would be a naval engagement, a siege, or a blockade. For Hayati, the concept of war wasn't abstract. It was the rhythmic reality of her life, the essential defense mechanism of her prosperous homeland. This perpetual conflict provided a demanding high-stakes proving ground for anyone entering the military ranks. You see her, perhaps in her late teens, standing on the ramparts overlooking the sea, her vision sharp, her mind already calculating wind direction and enemy approach vectors. She is not yet the famed admiral, but the foundations of that legend, the strategic mind, the deep technical knowledge, and the fierce loyalty to Aceh are already deeply set. You realize that the circumstances that allow a woman to rise to such power are complex, stemming from a unique blend of personal ambition, aristocratic privilege, and a national culture that valued skill in the defense of its maritime wealth. She was a product of the Spice Age, and a testament to the fact that power flowed not just from European capitals, but from the sophisticated, dynamic courts of Southeast Asia. The story now glides into a period of personal significance for Queen Malahayati, a period that cemented her connection to the Acehnese naval establishment forever. As a young woman of her status, marriage was both a political and personal inevitability. She was joined in wedlock to a high-ranking naval commander, who was the son of Sultan Sayyid. This union was far more than just a social arrangement. It was a formal merger of two powerful maritime families, guaranteeing Hayati continued access to the inner circles of military strategy and command. Her husband was not merely a figurehead, he was an active admiral. The quirky tidbit here is that, rather than being confined to domestic duties following her marriage, Hayati continued her intense education, often alongside her husband. They essentially attended graduate school together, not for law or literature, but for naval warfare. This school was the prestigious Bali Musra, or the Royal Naval Academy, the institution responsible for training the Sultanate's elite military officers. The Bali Musra was the apex of Acehnese military doctrine, a place where theoretical knowledge met the hard realities of sea combat. You can imagine the curriculum: advanced trigonometry for navigation, logistics for supplying large fleets far from home, the effective use of artillery, a subject constantly evolving with new gunpowder technologies, and, crucially, the study of enemy tactics. They didn't just drill soldiers, they cultivated strategic thinkers. You sit in on a lecture, perhaps where the focus is on how to use Aceh's shallow draft galleys to outmaneuver the deep-keeled, slow-turning Portuguese carracks in the confined waters of the strait. Hayati's presence in this intensely professional, Malay-dominated environment speaks volumes about the level of respect commanded by her family and her own undeniable aptitude. She wasn't there as a passive observer. She was an active student, absorbing the complexities of naval logistics and command structure. This hands-on high-level education is a crucial mainstream historical fact that completely refutes any notion that her later generalship was based on luck or whim. She was certified by the best military school in the region. Her relationship with her husband, the admiral, seems to have been a partnership built on shared professional interests. They would have reviewed battle plans together, discussed intelligence reports on the latest VOC movements, and overseen training exercises. This intimate, continuous exposure to high command provided Hayati with experience equivalent to years spent on active duty, making her a co-strategist in the Sultanate's defense before she even held a formal command herself. The Sultanate of Aceh, under Sultan Soid al-Mukamil, was at its military zenith during this period. The Sultan was a seasoned ruler who understood the necessity of aggressive defense. The state was heavily centralized around maritime power. Historians still argue whether the Sultan actively encouraged highborn women like Hayati to pursue military knowledge as a contingency plan, knowing the high casualty rates among male commanders, or if Hayati was simply an extraordinary exception to the rule. Regardless, the political system allowed for her development. You see them now, the young admiral and his wife, overseeing a massive fleet review in the harbor. The ships are sleek, fast, and heavily armed with locally cast and imported cannons. They symbolize the wealth and ambition of Aceh, a power intent on maintaining its trade dominance against European encroachment. You notice the Acehnese understanding of gunpowder warfare is highly advanced. They treat their cannons not just as noisemakers, but as precision instruments of destruction. This period of joint command experience was her final apprenticeship. It equipped her with the authority and the technical vocabulary necessary to command respect from the hardened, often cynical, veteran captains who would eventually serve under her. No one could dismiss her as a royal figurehead. She had done the time, studied the doctrine, and understood the brutal mechanics of naval engagement. If you think about it, she got a better, more practical military education than most European noblemen of the time, who often bought their commissions based solely on title. This relative stability, however, was about to be shattered. The intense pressure from the Europeans meant that war was always imminent, and the Acehnese naval commanders were constantly deployed to repel incursions, police the straits, and occasionally conduct punitive raids on enemy strongholds. The knowledge she gained during this period of tutelage, the intimate understanding of the fleet's strengths and weaknesses, would soon be put to the ultimate test in the most tragic way possible for her. The academy training, the shared command, the powerful marriage-all. This preparation was unknowingly setting the stage for a dramatic transition from strategist's wife to the supreme commander herself. The tranquility of the court was deceptive, a thin veneer over the constant churn of maritime conflict that defined life in the Spice Age. You step aboard one of the Acehnese war galleys now, and the sheer physicality of the Navy hits you. The smell of salt, sweat, and gunpowder is everywhere. This is where Malahayati's theoretical education from the Bali Musra translated into ironclad reality. To understand her success, you must understand the tools she inherited, the sophisticated, aggressive Acehnese naval forces. The backbone of this fleet was the galley, though not the ancient Mediterranean trireme you might imagine. The Acehnese developed highly adapted regional designs, often categorized generally as Lankaran or Galliacislic, long vessels that were hybrid Sailandor-driven. This allowed them a critical advantage, the ability to maneuver precisely in the often windless tide-heavy waters of the straits, independent of the vagaries of the monsoon winds. The massive European galleons, while floating fortresses in the open sea, were often cumbersome and easily becalmed in the confined nearshore environments where most battles were fought. The Acehnese naval doctrine was built around speed, surprise, and overwhelming close-range firepower. The ships were heavily armed, not just with swivel guns and small cannons, but increasingly with larger caliber artillery, often cast locally or imported from the Ottoman Empire. The unique design and deployment of these weapons is a crucial mainstream historical fact. The Acehnese recognized that the wooden hulls of the European ships were vulnerable to cannon fire, especially below the waterline or at close quarters. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Acehnese often employed a tactic known as ramming and boarding even into the age of gunpowder, deploying specialized soldiers known for their ferocity and proficiency with traditional weapons like kreese and spears alongside firearms. They wouldn't just trade cannon shots from a distance. They sought to get in close, disable the European ships, rigging a rudder with a few well-aimed shots, and then swarm the deck, transforming the sea battle into a brutal hand-to-hand fight, a style the Europeans were often ill-prepared for. You see the naval soldiers, heavily muscled and hardened by the constant drilling, practicing grappling hooks and boarding maneuvers, their movements sharp and practiced. The use of gunpowder was not limited to heavy cannons. Acehnese ships were known to carry various forms of early naval explosives, including jars of burning oil or sulfur mixtures designed to be thrown or launched onto the enemy's decks, causing chaos and fire. Imagine the terror of facing such an attack. You have a massive slow ship, and suddenly, 3 sleek Acehnese vessels dart out of the mist, pouring cannon fire onto your rigging while soldiers throw flaming pots of liquid onto your deck. Survival chances plummet rapidly. The command structure was also highly disciplined. The admirals, like Heidi's husband, were expected to be masters of both seamanship and logistics. They had to manage the huge challenge of keeping hundreds of men, multiple ships, and tons of gunpowder supplied across vast distances. The success of the Acehnese fleet was dependent on a well-organized supply chain that included secure inland fortresses and forward resupply points along the coast. This sophisticated naval power was directly linked to the Sultanate's ability to maintain its independence. The Portuguese had spent decades trying to break Aceh's maritime grip, and every skirmish was a high-stakes lesson in warfare. When the Dutch arrived, they didn't encounter a disorganized resistance. They met a seasoned, battle-hardened navy that had been perfecting its anti-European tactics for over a century. Historians still argue whether the aggressive expansion of the Acehnese navy during the late 16th century was primarily reactive, necessary defense against Portugal, or proactive, a deliberate strategy to establish a regional maritime empire based on absolute trade monopoly. Either way, the result was the same, a powerful military machine that was about to be led by an unconventional commander. As you observe the disciplined loading of the cannons and the coordinated rowing patterns of the galleys, you realize that Hayati's later success wasn't a fluke of command. It was the product of utilizing a highly effective, specialized military system tailored perfectly to the local environment. She knew these ships, their limits, and their maximum potential for destruction. She understood that a single, well-placed Assanese warship was worth 3 cumbersome European trading vessels, especially in the close-quarter fighting endemic to the Malacca Strait. She was inheriting a weapon forged by decades of successful resistance, and she knew exactly how to point it. And soon, the tragic loss that had been looming since her marriage would provide the catalyst for her to take hold of that weapon and wield it herself. It's an incredibly potent picture, the most powerful navy in the region, about to be commanded by a grieving widow with nothing left to lose. The rhythmic life of the Assanese naval base, the organized chaos of training, the constant coming and going of ships is abruptly halted by tragedy. You feel the heavy, visceral shock that grips the capital. Hayati's husband, the Admiral, Sultan Soyid Al-Mukamil's son, is dead. He was killed in a major naval engagement against the Portuguese, most likely near the crucial stronghold of Malacca, a constant friction point between the European power and the independent sultanates. This loss is the single most important catalyst for Kumallah Hayati's transformation from royal strategist. In the 16th and early 17th centuries, naval warfare was spectacularly brutal, a grim lottery where commanders were often targeted first. His death was not just a personal grief, it was a blow to the state, removing a seasoned, well-educated admiral at a time when European pressure was mounting intensely. You witnessed the solemnity of the funeral rites, the powerful display of public mourning for a hero lost in the defense of Aceh's sovereignty. But you also witnessed the quiet, internal shift in Hayati. Her grief is channeled not into withdrawal, but into a fierce, cold resolve. Under the prevailing system, a widow, even one of high aristocratic standing, might have been expected to retire from public life, perhaps devoting herself to religious scholarship or courtly pursuits. But Hayati was not most widows. The combination of her military education, her direct experience in Kokama, and the burning desire for vengeance against the perpetual enemy, the European interlopers, provided a unique path. This personal vow to avenge her husband's death by driving the Portuguese, and later the Dutch, from Assanese waters is a crucial mainstream historical fact that defines her remaining life. A significant, quirky or fringe tidbit is how this tragedy led to a direct and immediate reorganization of the state's military resources. Hayati successfully petitioned the Sultan, her father-in-law, to allow her to take command of a new, highly specialized unit. She argued that the men who survived these constant bloody wars were needed for the main fleet, but that there was a massive, untapped resource of personnel who were equally motivated: the women whose husbands and sons had been lost in battle. The argument was simple and devastatingly effective. Who better to fight a war than those who have personally paid the ultimate price for it? Historians still argue whether the Sultan's decision to grant her this command was primarily a matter of political expediency, recognizing her strategic talent and the need for fresh manpower, if it was a profound cultural statement about the role of women in Assanese society under existential threat. Either way, the result was revolutionary. Hayati wasn't asking for a ceremonial title, she was asking for the authority to raise and train a professional fighting force, a demand that would have been completely unthinkable, even scandalous, in contemporary London or Lisbon. You see her transitioning, not just spiritually, but physically. She trades the silks of the court for the practical, durable clothing of a commander. Her focus is absolute. She is driven by a deep sense of justice and patriotism, but it is undeniably fused with a personal, unshakable need for retribution. The ships that carry the flag of USA are now the instruments of her mourning. This period also marks the transition of USA's primary concern. While the Portuguese had been the long-standing adversary, the newly arriving Dutch under the VOC represented a different, more insidious threat. The Portuguese sought ports and physical control. The Dutch sought a total crushing monopoly over the trade itself, which meant eliminating ESE as an economic competitor entirely. Hayati's vow of vengeance was initially aimed at Portugal, but her strategic mind quickly realized the greater impending threat from the Netherlands. The concept of a military unit born out of collective grief and a desire for vengeance is powerful. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? This is the emotional equivalent to strange, powerful force used for practical, brutal ends. This is not the gentle resignation of a widow. It is the strategic mobilization of sorrow. She now begins the immense logistical task of creating her own fleet. This required not just ships, but political maneuvering, securing funding from the court, and convincing seasoned military officials to support her radical idea. The first and most critical step in her ascent to the rank of admiral was successfully pitching the concept of the Inong Balee, the Widows, army or fleet project that would solidify her place in history. Her personal tragedy provided the emotional fuel, but her rigorous education provided the engine for this historic military undertaking. The focus now shifts to the political landscape that made Hayati's military command not just possible, but necessary. The Sultan under whom her husband served and died was Soyed al-Mukamil. But the key political figure who facilitated Hayati's rise was his successor, Sultanah Safiatuddin Shah. You observe the inner workings of the Asani's court, a place of refined manners and ruthless political calculation. Safiatuddin's reign began in 1641. But Hayati's power was already significant in the late 16th century, demonstrating a long period of female influence. Even before Safiatuddin took the throne, the political climate was moving toward recognizing capable women. Sultanah Safiatuddin's eventual accession and the subsequent era of 4 consecutive female sultans in ESA is a crucial mainstream historical fact that highlights the exceptional nature of Asani's gender politics in the 17th century. This wasn't simply a matter of a strong woman holding power. It represented a structural acceptance of female sovereignty, which contrasted radically with European courts, where the Salic law or equivalent customs often strictly prohibited women from inheriting the crown. It was in this evolving, though still volatile, environment that Kumala Hayati presented her radical proposal. She approached the ruling sultan initially, her father-in-law, and later, the ruling court with the plan for the Inong Balee. This was not a backroom favor. It was a complex logistical and political undertaking that required royal sanction. Hayati needed ships, cannons, provisions, and, most importantly, the authority to recruit and command. The court, reeling from continuous naval losses to the Portuguese and anticipating the inevitable, bigger conflicts with the Dutch, was desperate for effective solutions. Hayati's brilliance was in her political pitch. She wasn't asking for funds to raise a traditional army. She was tapping into a resource that was both numerous and profoundly motivated, the thousands of women who had been widowed by the wars at sea. Her argument was highly strategic. These women, having lost everything, had nothing left to fear and everything to fight for. Their loyalty to Aceh's defense would be absolute, fueled by personal grief and national patriotism. The unique emotional and psychological advantage of this force, fascinating, quirky tidbit, made the concept irresistible to the military council. The Sultanate, recognizing her strategic acumen and her background in the Bali Musra, granted her the title of Admiral, or Laksamana. This title wasn't honorary. It gave her explicit command over a segment of the fleet and the authority to establish her own military corps. She wasn't a queen commanding a fleet, incidentally. She was a professional naval officer, promoted based on merit and circumstance. Historians still argue whether the court's swift approval of the Inong Balee was solely due to Hayati's political skill, or if there were already pre-existing smaller female military or palace guard units that laid the groundwork for this acceptance. Regardless, Hayati's appointment was the official and unprecedented elevation of a woman to the very top echelon of the Sultanate's military hierarchy. You watch as she moves through the court. She has the confidence of someone who knows her value. She negotiates the allocation of resources, prime dockyard space, access to the royal armories, and a secure funding stream with the political skill of a seasoned diplomat. She wasn't just given a fleet. She had to build the entire infrastructure required to support it. She ensured her forces would be housed, trained, and permanently stationed at a dedicated fortress and naval base, creating a self-sufficient, formidable command structure. The political support from the highest levels was critical. This backing, especially the later presence of a sultana on the throne, provided an official veneer of legitimacy that helped counter any internal Malay-dominated resistance to her command. She was acting with the full authority of the state. The environment of constant threat played directly into her hands. When the nation is facing an existential crisis from a power like the Portuguese or the VOC, efficiency and results become the most important metrics. Hayati promised results, drawing upon a motivated pool of personnel. The Acehnese court was pragmatic. They saw the Dutch fleet growing daily and knew that every skilled commander and every disciplined fighting force was essential for survival. By securing the Sultan's and later the Sultana's full endorsement, Hayati successfully insulated her command from the typical bureaucratic resistance, ensuring that her revolutionary force would soon be ready to meet the biggest naval threat the Sultanate had ever faced. She had successfully navigated the court and was now ready to navigate the open seas. The political stage is set, the authority is granted, and now you witness the birth of one of history's most unique military organizations, the Inong Balee. The name literally translates to Widow's Army, or more accurately, for this context, the Widow's Fleet. This was not a militia. It was a professional, standing naval force, an initiative spearheaded and brought to fruition by Malahayati. The creation of the Inong Balee was a monumental logistical and social achievement. Hayati began by establishing a dedicated naval base and fortress near the capital, providing a home, a training facility, and a strategic command center for her forces. Recruitment was focused exclusively on the women who had lost husbands or male relatives in the conflicts against the Portuguese and other European aggressors. You see thousands of these women arriving, fueled by a powerful mix of grief, patriotism, and the realization that joining this corps offered them economic security and a chance for direct retribution. For many, it was the only honorable path left in a world disrupted by war. The training regimen Hayati instituted was notoriously rigorous. These women were not trained to be auxiliaries. They were trained to be professional sailors, gunners, and naval infantry. They learned to handle the massive rudders of the Acehnese galleys, to climb the complex rigging, and to navigate by the stars and local currents. Crucially, they were intensively trained in gunpowder warfare. You can hear the deafening crack of the cannons during their drills. They were taught how to load, aim, and fire the heavy artillery imported from the Ottomans, a task requiring immense strength, coordination, and technical precision. A crucial mainstream historical fact is that the Inong Balee was not just a symbol of resistance. It was a highly effective fighting force. Its ships were designed to be faster and more maneuverable than European vessels, and the crews were bound by an extraordinary level of discipline and morale forged by shared tragedy. This fleet was instrumental in defending the strategic port of Esa, ensuring that the Sultanate could maintain its lucrative control over the spice trade. The fleet's size and structure were substantial. At its peak, the Inong Balee may have included several thousand personnel, both fighting sailors and support staff, and commanded a significant number of the Sultanate's fastest and most advanced vessels. Hayati's genius was in recognizing that a motivated, dedicated force could easily outperform a traditional, less passionate military, especially one often riddled with desertion and political infighting. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is the uniform and weaponry. While historical accounts are often vague, it is recorded that the Inong Balee adopted specialized attire that allowed for ease of movement during naval combat, and they often wielded the traditional asanas, renkong dagger, or the pedang sword. In addition to muskets and cannons, their training focused heavily on close-quarters boarding action, where their superior knowledge of the ship and high motivation gave them an edge over the offensively and surprised European crews. You observed the community life within the fortress walls. This was a completely unique societal model. Fortress staffed, run, and defended entirely by women. They managed the complex logistics of provisioning the fleet, maintaining the weaponry, and overseeing the repair docks. Hayati was not only a military admiral, but also an administrator and a community leader, responsible for the welfare of thousands. Historians still argue whether the creation of the Inong Balee was a purely indigenous development, or if it was partially inspired by earlier traditions of female warriors in the region, such as the famous Vietnamese Trying Sisters or local Sumatran armed groups. Regardless of the inspiration, its establishment as a state-funded professional navy was unique in the world at the time. As you walk through the training grounds, the energy is palpable. You see women performing drills with the precision of hardened veterans. This isn't just a place of training, It's a testament to resilience, a place where profound personal loss was transformed into organized military power. Malahayati, the Laksamana, commands with a confidence born of knowledge. She knows every aspect of her ships, every strength of her sailors, and every weakness of her enemies. The Inong Balee is now a formidable weapon, and it is poised to enter its first major confrontations, ready to show the European powers that the fight for the spice trade was not just a battle against a sultan, but a fight against the collective, vengeful force of Acehnese womanhood. They are disciplined, they are armed, and they are about to become the nightmare of the Dutch East India Company. The stage is now completely set for the inevitable conflict. While Malahayati was establishing her Inong Balee fleet and perfecting her tactics, a massive storm was brewing on the horizon, carried by the sails of the Verenigde Oostindische Company, or the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. You watch from the Acehnese coastline as the first Dutch ships arrive with a mix of arrogance and overwhelming capital. This is where the conflict pivots from a localized, low-level war against the Portuguese to an existential fight against a global corporate behemoth. The VOC was incorporated in 1602, emerging from several smaller, competing Dutch trading companies. It was, and this is a crucial mainstream historical fact, the first company in history to issue stock, making it incredibly well-capitalized a financial entity so vast it commanded more resources than many European nation-states. Their mandate was simple: secure a monopoly on the spice trade. Their method was brutal: eliminate all competitors, local and European. Through diplomacy backed by overwhelming military force, the Dutch strategy was distinct from the Portuguese. The Portuguese sought to control strategic choke points like Malacca and hold them with fortified garrisons. The Dutch, however, wanted to control the source of the spices, especially pepper, nutmeg, and cloves, and force the local rulers to sell exclusively to them at prices dictated by the VOC. This required a relentless, expansive military presence and a systematic destruction of indigenous trade networks, including Ace's vast shipping lanes. You observe the sheer technological advantage the Dutch brought: large, well-armed, purpose-built cargo ships like the Flight for Efficiency, and heavy, powerful warships designed to sustain and deliver immense broadsides. While Malahayati's galleys were faster and more maneuverable in shallow water, the Dutch brought the brute force of floating artillery platforms into the open ocean. The VOC's initial approach to a sect was deceptively commercial. They arrived seeking favorable treaties and pepper concessions. But behind the polite requests lay a chilling threat. If ESA refused to cooperate on Dutch terms, the VOC would simply blockade. Acehnese ports intercept their trade with other powers like the Ottomans and the various Indian kingdoms and starve the Sultanate into submission. This move toward economic warfare, supported by military coercion, was the hallmark of the VOC's strategy. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is the contrast in command philosophy. Acehnese admirals were highly visible, leading from the front, often trained in the complex religious and political doctrines of the state. Dutch commanders, conversely, were essentially armed CEOs. They were motivated purely by profit margins, risk assessments, and shareholder returns back in Amsterdam. They saw the local rulers not as fellow sovereigns, but as obstacles to be either bribed, intimidated, or obliterated. This clash of worldviews, honor and sovereignty versus pure, quantifiable, profit-made mutual understanding, almost impossible. Historians still argue whether the VOC's initial leaders, like Cornelis de Houtman, whom we'll meet soon, genuinely underestimated the Acehnese military capacity, or if their arrogance was a deliberate political posture. What is clear is that they completely failed to account for the strategic genius and personal motivation of Malahayati. The arrival of the Dutch was a seismic event. The court and ESA realized they couldn't simply rely on old tactics against this new, ruthlessly efficient enemy. The stakes had been dramatically raised. The battle was no longer just about territory. It was about whether USA would retain its economic independence or be reduced. To a corporate subsidiary of a trading company headquartered thousands of miles away, Malahayati and the Inong Balee now found their true purpose. They were no longer just a defensive force against the fading Portuguese. They were the cutting edge of Ace's resistance against the emerging global corporate order. You see the women practicing their boarding drills with renewed intensity. They know the enemy is smarter, richer, and more heavily armed than any they have faced before. But they also know the Dutch weakness: a blind, arrogant overestimation of their own superiority. And it is this weakness that Admiral Hayati is preparing to exploit with cold, calculated precision. She understood that speed and morale could defeat mere size and financial backing. The tension that has been building since the arrival of the Dutch now breaks into active confrontation. Hayati is ready. You are witnessing the Inong Balee in action for the first time, and it is a masterful demonstration of naval strategy tailored to the local environment. Hayati's initial naval engagements were crucial tests of her command and the effectiveness of her unique fleet, primarily focused on challenging Portuguese remnants and repelling the early, probing Dutch scouting missions. Her tactical brilliance lay in her understanding of the geography of the Malacca Strait, hundreds of small islands, treacherous currents, and shallow anchorages. This knowledge is a crucial mainstream historical fact. While European captains relied on deep-sea charts and open-water tactics, Hayati used the complex coastline as her greatest weapon. She did not seek massive, decisive battles in the open sea, where the heavy Dutch broadsides would have been overwhelming. Instead, she favored asymmetric warfare, ambushes, night attacks, and swift engagements in confined channels. You watch one such engagement, a small Dutch or Portuguese trading fleet, perhaps a dozen vessels, is attempting to slip through a narrow passage, thinking they are safe near the shore. Suddenly, from hidden coves or behind jungle-covered islands, the sleek, low-slung galleys of the Inong Balee appear. Hayati is often on the command vessel, directing the attack through precise flag and drum signals. Her ships are faster under oar, closing the distance rapidly, making it impossible for the European gunners to effectively train their heavy cannons, which are designed for long-range, flat trajectories. The morale of the Inong Balee crews proved to be its greatest asset. Fueled by their vow and expertly led, they executed the rapid close-quarters maneuvers flawlessly. Their objective was not just to sink the ships, but to capture the cargo and the intelligence. They employed the ramming and boarding technique with terrifying efficiency, transforming the naval battle into a chaos of musketry and steel on the enemy decks. The sight of these disciplined, fierce female warriors swarming a ship was reportedly unnerving to the European sailors, who were often ill-prepared for such close, intense fighting. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is the use of fireships, or deliberately set ablaze vessels, in these early confrontations. Hayati's fleet was adept at preparing and launching these terrifying weapons into crowded enemy anchorages or narrow waterways, creating immense panic and forcing the Europeans to expend valuable time and water defending against the flames rather than the main attack. These initial victories sent ripples of unease through the VOC command. Their commanders were reporting not just losses, but confrontations with a highly unusual, organized force under a woman's command, a concept entirely foreign to their worldview. They couldn't dismiss Hayati as a mere pirate or a localized chieftain. Her command was clearly systematic, professional, and backed by the full resources of the powerful Sultanate. Historians still argue whether Hayati's primary motivation in these early skirmishes was punitive vengeance against the Portuguese, or if she was strategically practicing her fleet and refining her asymmetric tactics in preparation for the inevitable, larger confrontation with the Dutch. What is undeniable is that every successful engagement increased the confidence of the Inong Balee and solidified Hayati's authority both within the fleet and at the Asani's court. She was proving beyond doubt that her unorthodox command structure worked. These battles also provided essential intelligence. Captured prisoners and documents gave Hayati vital insight into the Dutch East India Company's operational procedures, preferred shipping routes, and the destinations of their lucrative cargo details she would use to plan her most damaging strategic moves. Remember that rigorous education she received in naval strategy. She was applying it now, not just as a tactical commander, but as an intelligence operator and logician, calculating the economic damage of every captured vessel. You see her standing on the deck, surveying the damage after a successful raid, the smoke clearing over the water. She is calm, analytical, focused on the immediate task of salvage and the future task of confrontation. The skirmishes are over, but they were merely the prelude to her grand strategy, using the Inong Balee to choke the life out of European trade by controlling the most vital sea artery in Asia. The time for small raids is ending. The time for a full-scale blockade is approaching. With her initial victories establishing the Inong Balee as a credible, devastating force, Malahayati moved beyond mere skirmishes to implement a strategy of overwhelming economic warfare. You are watching a masterstroke of geopolitical leverage, the blockade of the Malacca Strait. This act was not simply a local annoyance. It was a dagger aimed at the very heart of European commerce in Asia, making it a crucial mainstream historical fact. The Malacca Strait is one of the most vital narrow shipping channels in the world, linking the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. Any ship carrying spices, silks, jewels, or ceramics between East and West must pass through this bottleneck. By establishing an effective continuous naval presence along the Sumatran side of the strait, Hayati could monitor, intercept, and paralyze trade, both the Portuguese shipping from their base at Malacca and the nascent, high-value voyages of the Dutch East India Company. The blockade was executed with brilliant precision, reflecting Hayati's deep understanding of local logistics and intelligence. She didn't have to sink every ship, she only had to make the passage prohibitively risky. The Inong Balee galleys, with their speed and shallow draft, were perfectly suited for this task. They operated from hidden bases along the coast, relying on local fishing communities and intelligence networks for real-time updates on approaching traffic. They would launch coordinated, swift attacks on vulnerable, slow-moving European ships, ensuring that the reputation of the Laksamana admiral became synonymous with inevitable capture or destruction. You can sense the rising panic in the European trading houses. Insurance rates for ships passing through the strait skyrocketed, and major European investors began to worry about the reliability of their supply lines. The blockade effectively challenged the fundamental premise of European economic expansion, that they could dictate terms and enjoy safe passage. A fascinating, quirky tidbit emerges regarding the blockade's psychological warfare. Hayati often released a few low-value prisoners back to Malacca, or the early Dutch trading posts, loaded not with ransom demands, but with tales of the fearsome, disciplined women warriors of Aceh. These reports, often exaggerated by terror, served Hayati's purpose, perfectly creating a reputation for invincibility that caused many European ships to attempt long, dangerous detours through less charted pirate-instead waters, often leading to shipwrecks and losses without Hayati having to fire a shot. The Dutch, with their focus on maximizing profit, were particularly incensed. Every captured ship full of pepper or nutmeg was a direct loss to the VOC's staggering balance sheet. Their response was predictable. They saw Hayati not as a legitimate commander, but as a highly successful pirate to be crushed. Their growing determination to eliminate this female nuisance brought them into direct confrontation, which was exactly what Hayati had anticipated. She was baiting the corporate giant into a localized fight where her advantages, speed, local knowledge, and motivation would be maximized. Historians still argue whether the blockade was truly continuous and total, or if it was a highly effective series of aggressive interdictions that felt like a total blockade to the European merchants. Either way, the strategic impact was the same. Hayati raised her profile from a regional commander to a figure who directly threatened the economic stability of the emerging Dutch global empire. This period also saw Hayati demonstrating her diplomatic skills, as she sometimes chose to release ships belonging to friendly Chian states, or even selectively English East India Company vessels, in an effort to subtly play the English against the Dutch. She was creating a complex web of alliances and antagonisms on the water, proving that her command was driven by astute political calculation, not just vengeance. You stand at the edge of the water, watching the Asanis galleys patrol the dark waves. The sea, once the open path for global trade, has become a suffocating noose tightening around the neck of the VOC. The success of the blockade brings the final, inevitable confrontation to Aceh's doorstep. Commanded by the man the Dutch East India Company considered their best hope for breaking the stalemate, Hayati's strategic challenge has forced the Dutch to commit a major expedition, and she is ready to meet them on her terms. The successful blockade has finally drawn out the main opponent. You are now introduced to the man who embodies the ruthless ambition of the Dutch East India Company, Cornelis de Houtman. De Houtman was a Dutch explorer and merchant, often credited with leading the first Dutch expedition to the East Indies between 1595 and 1597. His arrival marks a critical turning point, escalating the conflict from raids to a full-scale corporate war. De Houtman's previous expedition had been a mixed bag. He managed to reach Banten in Java, securing a small cargo of spices, but his arrogant, often brutal behavior caused friction with local rulers, resulting in clashes and significant crew losses. Despite his personal failures in diplomacy, his voyage confirmed the possibility of breaking the Portuguese monopoly, and he returned to the Netherlands a national hero of sorts, securing substantial backing for a new, punitive expedition. He was essentially the poster child for Dutch colonial aggression. He arrived in the Asana sphere of influence with a mandate: secure pepper contracts, establish a permanent trading post, and, if necessary, subdue any local resistance that threatened the VOC's profit margins. His disposition was notoriously arrogant, a crucial mainstream historical fact. He held a profound contempt for the local rulers, viewing them as obstacles to be brushed aside by the superiority of European arms and finance. This hubris would prove fatal when encountering the calculated ferocity of Admiral Malahayati. De Houtman represented the purely mercantile and militaristic aspect of the Dutch intrusion. He wasn't interested in religious conversion or long-term governance. He was interested in logistics, price control, and monopoly. His ships were armed not for defense, but for coercion. He brought with him the expectation that local sultans would crumble before the sight of his heavy artillery and the promise of European goods. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is that de Houtman was known to be incredibly volatile. His previous expedition had ended in mutiny and imprisonment at the hands of local rulers in Java before being ransomed. This hot temper and propensity for violence meant that diplomacy, even when attempted, often quickly devolved into hostility. Hayati, who was known for her strategic patience and calm command, would face a perfect psychological foil in the impulsive, rageful Dutchman. Historians still argue whether de Houtman's mission to Aceh in 1599 was purely economic or if he was carrying secret orders. From the fledgling VOC to test the military capacity of the Assanis to see if an outright military conquest was feasible. Either way, his arrival in Aceh's waters signaled the end of any peaceful negotiation. You watch as his ships approach the harbor, their sails full, representing the unstoppable financial might of Amsterdam. De Houtman initially attempted to negotiate, sending envoys to the Sultan's court with demands for exclusive trading rights and the cessation of all Inong Balee attacks, but he did so from a position of aggression, seizing several smaller Assanis trading vessels outside the port as collateral to force the Sultan's hand. This act of provocation was a massive miscalculation. He had underestimated the resolve of the Sultanate and gravely misunderstood the position and authority of the admiral he was about to face. The Assanis court, guided by Hayati's intelligence, saw through the thin veneer of trade and recognized the naked threat. They knew that agreeing to de Houtman's terms meant economic subjugation. The time for parley was over. Hayati, having effectively used the blockade to draw the Dutch into her chosen Kilzona harbor area close to her fortress, and her tactical advantages, now prepared her forces for the decisive confrontation. You see the preparations, the final loading of the cannons, the strategic positioning of the galleys, the detailed briefing of the Inong Balee commanders. They are not merely defending a port, they are defending their economic independence against the world's first global corporation. And leading the charge is a woman who has already vowed that her personal grief will be paid for by Dutch blood. Cornelis de Houtman sailed halfway around the world seeking pepper and gold. What he found instead was a vengeful navy commanded by a furious, brilliant admiral. The long-anticipated moment arrives, the Battle of Aceh Harbor in 1599. You are on the deck of an Assanis galley, feeling the vibration of the war drums. This was not a passive defense. It was a strategically planned, full-scale naval assault led by Malahayati herself. And it stands as a towering, crucial mainstream historical fact in the history of Asian resistance to European expansion. Cornelis de Houtman, confident in the superiority of his European warships, attempted to force his way into the harbor, likely with the intention of blockading the port and seizing whatever goods were docked there. He sailed in, expecting the traditional cautious response he was used to from local rulers. What he got was the fury of the Inong Balee. Hayati's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and perfectly suited to the terrain. She allowed de Houtman's ships to move into a position where they were confined by the harbor's narrow entrance and the shallow waters near the coast. Her smaller, faster galleys, powered by oars, swarmed the larger Dutch vessels. The maneuverability of the Assanis fleet was their key advantage. They could dart in, fire a precise broadside, and retreat before the slaughtering Dutch guns could be brought to bear effectively. You watch the chaos erupt. The air is thick with the smell of black powder and the roar of artillery. The Asanis focused their fire not on the thick hulls of the Dutch ships, but on the vulnerable rigging, masts, and decks. Disabling the rigging effectively turns the powerful galleon into a floating, immobile target, vulnerable to the final, terrifying stage of the Asanis' attack. Boarding, the Inong Balee forces executed the close-quarters attack with terrifying precision. Hayati commanded the overall fleet movements, ensuring a coordinated, continuous assault. Once the Asanis ships grappled onto a Dutch vessel, the highly motivated, disciplined female warriors surged across the decks, turning the battle into a desperate hand-to-hand brawl. The psychological shock of facing such a determined and unusual enemy played heavily into the hands of the Inong Balee. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is the recorded efficiency of the Asanis gunners. Having trained incessantly under Hayati, they were able to achieve a higher rate of fire and greater accuracy in close range than their European counterparts, who often struggled with damp powder and the heat in tropical climates. This technical proficiency gave them a distinct advantage, proving that their fleet was far more than just a symbolic force. The battle was short and decisive. De Houtman's arrogance and his misjudgment of the environment and his opponent led to a tactical disaster. The lack of maneuverability of his vessels, combined with the concentrated, aggressive focus of Hayati's fleet, resulted in the complete routing of the Dutch expedition. Several of de Houtman's ships were sunk or critically damaged. Historians still argue whether Hayati's primary command ship was a larger galley or a smaller, faster vessel used specifically for rapid maneuvering and communication during the battle. What is undisputed is that she was the architect and the direct commanding officer of the successful operation. She was in the thick of the action, directing the flow of the battle against one of the most powerful corporate military forces the world had yet seen. You feel the ship shudder as a nearby cannon fires. The outcome is clear. The Dutch, who had arrived expecting to dictate terms, were instead forced into a humiliating retreat, their mission an abject failure. The blockade was not only maintained, but cemented by this resounding victory. Hayati had done more than just win a battle. She had sent a clear, undeniable message back to Amsterdam. Isa was not open for business on Dutch terms, and in the ensuing chaos of the battle, the fate of the arrogant Cornelis de Houtman was sealed. The smoke clears from Isa harbor, revealing the complete and catastrophic failure of the Dutch expedition. The victory is Hayati's, and the price is paid by Cornelis de Houtman. This section details the dramatic climax of the 1599 battle, the death of the arrogant Dutch commander and the immediate powerful terms set by the victorious Asanis court. Cornelis de Houtman was killed during the thick of the close-quarters fighting, likely while his ship was being boarded by the Inong Balee forces. His demise is a crucial mainstream historical fact, marking the first major humiliating setback for the nascent Dutch East India Company in Asia, and solidifying Hayati's legend. You can imagine the scene, the confusion of the melee. The Dutch officers realizing too late that they were outmaneuvered, and the swift, fatal efficiency of the Asanis warriors. The Asanis acted immediately and decisively to consolidate their victory. The surviving Dutch ships were either captured or forced to flee, often leaving critically wounded personnel and valuable cargo behind. Hayati, now the undisputed heroine of the state, ensured that the terms presented to the surviving Dutch leaders were non-negotiable and intentionally humiliating. The message was designed to resonate not just locally, but all the way back to Amsterdam. The immediate terms included the complete surrender of all remaining weapons and charged the confiscation of the surviving Dutch ships and cargo as reparations for the conflict, and most crucially, the imprisonment of Cornelis's brother, Frederick de Houtman, who had been captured during the battle. This capture of a high-value hostage gave USA immense political leverage, demonstrating Hayati's strategic foresight in managing the aftermath. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is the historical debate about who exactly killed Cornelis de Houtman. While many Asanis accounts credit Admiral Hayati herself with delivering the fatal blow, a powerful narrative of personal vengeance, most Western sources are simply vague, noting he died in the fighting. Historians still argue whether Hayati personally killed him or if she merely commanded the troops who did, recognizing that the dramatic personal account serves as a powerful symbol of her command and her vow of vengeance. Hayati's actions immediately following the battle were those of a seasoned diplomat and strategist, not a vengeful killer. She utilized the victory to strengthen the Sultanate's position. The captured charts and weapons provided invaluable intelligence on Dutch naval technology and routes, helping the Hassani's military to adapt further. The captured ships were often repaired and incorporated into the Inong Balee fleet, turning a Dutch loss into an Hassani's gain. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen, the memory device we used earlier? This victory serves as a similar marker, a powerful reminder that in this part of the world, European superiority was a myth that could be brutally and definitively shattered. The immediate execution of the terms ensured there was no possibility of the defeated Dutch regrouping or negotiating from a position of strength. By seizing all assets and personnel, the Sultanate showed that they treated the VOC not as a sovereign power, but as a hostile, defeated corporate entity. This set an incredibly strong precedent for future interactions with all European powers. The strategic imprisonment of Frederick de Houtman was Hayati's masterstroke in the immediate post-battle situation. He was not just a grieving brother, he was a valuable asset, a recognized figure in the Dutch hierarchy, whose freedom would be worth a massive ransom. This action converted a short-term military victory into a long-term diplomatic advantage, ensuring that the Hassani's court would maintain the upper hand in subsequent negotiations with the VOC. You see Hayati overseeing the harbor cleanup, her expression calm despite the bloodshed. The battle was won, the enemy commander was dead, and the Hassani's flag flew triumphant over the captured Dutch vessels. She had avenged her husband and, more importantly, demonstrated that the Inong Balee was the key to preserving ESA's sovereignty against the world's most powerful corporation. The next move belonged entirely to Amsterdam, which was about to receive the most unwelcome news in its burgeoning imperial history. The immediate aftermath of the battle focused on the extremely valuable human collateral secured by Admiral Malahayati, the capture and imprisonment of Frederick de Houtman. You stand inside the Hassani's fortress where Frederick is held, a prisoner of war whose fate is now a critical pawn in the global chess game between ESA and the VOC. This event is a crucial mainstream historical fact that allowed ESA to dictate terms to the most powerful corporation of the era. Frederick de Houtman, the brother of the slain Cornelis, was a highly educated and prominent figure in the Dutch expedition. His capture was not accidental. It was the intended consequence of Hayati's tactical planning. By holding him, the Hassani's court, under Hayati's strategic guidance, possessed undeniable leverage. They knew that the VOC, driven by reputation and a need to maintain the morale of its commanders, would pay a fortune to secure his release. His imprisonment was not intended to be overtly brutal, but it was certainly intended to be uncomfortable and protracted. You can imagine Frederick confined within the sturdy stone walls of the Inong Balee fortress. Realizing the gravity of his situation, he was not just a prisoner of war, he was an economic asset held by an enemy commander who was both highly intelligent and deeply motivated. During his captivity, Frederick actually proved to be a source of unintended benefits for his captors. He learned the local Malay language and, interestingly, spent time compiling a Malay-Dutch dictionary and documenting his observations of Hassani's culture, a fascinating, quirky tidbit that showcases the resilience of the human mind, even in duress. This material, though created by a captive, provided the Hassani's with further insight into Dutch perspectives. Their language and their thought processes intelligence Hayati would have appreciated. Historians still argue whether the long duration of Frederick's imprisonment, lasting over 2 years, was solely due to the massive ransom demanded by USET, or if the Sultanate deliberately prolonged the negotiation to maximize the diplomatic leverage against the VOC and to demonstrate the strength of their position. What is certain is that every day Frederick spent in ESE was a victory for Hayati. The VOC attempted to secure his release quickly and cheaply, but they were met with unyielding demands from the Hassani's court, demands that Hayati would have helped formulate. They insisted not only on an exorbitant ransom in gold and pepper, but also on specific trading concessions that favored USA and required the VOC to formally acknowledge the Sultanate's sovereignty and its control over the straits. Hayati's role in this was to ensure that the military advantage gained in the battle was not squandered at the negotiating table. She would have advised the Sultan that giving up Frederick easily would signal weakness. His continued captivity was a constant public symbol of Dutch humiliation and Hassanist supremacy. It also served as a clear warning to any future Dutch expedition that arrogance would be met with swift and painful consequences. You see the complexity of the situation. Frederick, a prisoner, is unknowingly aiding his captors through his scholarly work, while his distant employers are frantically trying to secure his release without appearing too weak. This whole saga, the capture, the ransom demand, the long wait, became a massive drain on the VOC's prestige and coffers, proving that local resistance, when strategically applied, could effectively challenge the financial power of the largest global corporation. The fact that Hayati, a woman, was instrumental in capturing and holding such a prominent European figure while contemporary. European women had virtually no legal rights is the powerful historical contrast at the core of our story. You recall how in Europe, property was often controlled by men. Here, Hayati controlled a Dutchman's fate and a substantial amount of the VOC's global capital. Her authority was absolute in this domain. The long, arduous negotiations for Frederick's release would soon begin. A battle of wits and willpower that followed the clash of cannons. The news of the disaster in Isa Harbor did not travel quickly, but when it hit Amsterdam, it was an economic and political bombshell. You are now shifting focus, transported thousands of miles away to the bustling, wealthy port city of Amsterdam, the nerve center of the Dutch Republic and the headquarters of the VOC. This reaction is a crucial mainstream historical fact that demonstrates the global impact of Hayati's victory. The initial reports of the destroyed fleet, the dead commander Cornelis de Houtman, and the captured brother Frederick de Houtman were met with shock and disbelief. The VOC shareholders, who had invested staggering sums in this venture, were furious. This was not a minor skirmish. It was a resounding defeat at the hands of a power they arrogantly viewed as inferior, and it represented a massive loss of capital and prestige. The economic shock rippled through the financial markets. Investors had poured money into the VOC on the premise of guaranteed, cheap spice supply and the easy subjugation of local competitors. Hayati's victory shattered that premise. The price of pepper on the European market immediately soared as news of the Malacca Strait blockade and the destruction of the Dutch fleet spread. This direct link between a battle fought off the coast of Sumatra and the price of commodities in European markets underscores the interconnectedness of the 17th century global economy. You walk through the bustling streets of Amsterdam, overhearing the frantic chatter in the coffee houses and trading floors. The atmosphere is thick with anxiety and anger. The political outrage was equally intense. The VOC was a quasi-state entity, and the humiliation of having a prominent expedition defeated and one of its leaders held for ransom by an Eastern queen was seen as a direct affront to Dutch national pride and its rising maritime dominance. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is the propaganda response. The Dutch media of the time, often commissioned by the VOC, struggled to frame the disaster. They could not honestly portray the Assanis as a sophisticated professional military force led by a brilliant female admiral. Instead, they often resorted to exaggerating the cruelty of the Assanis and downplaying the size and organization of the Inong Balee fleet, attempting to reduce Hayati to a figure of exotic savagery rather than a genuine strategic threat. This effort to delegitimize her command reflects the sheer difficulty the European mind had in processing a female military victor. Historians still argue whether the defeat of Cornelis de Houtman was the sole catalyst for the formal establishment of the unified Verenigde Oost-Indische Company VOC in 1602, or if the process was already underway. However, the disaster certainly accelerated the need for centralization. The multiple competing Dutch companies realized they needed a single, unified, and better-funded military force to overcome such organized resistance, leading to the formation of the massive VOC with its enhanced governmental powers. The decision to free Frederick de Houtman became a primary directive for the VOC. They realized that their ongoing credibility depended on securing his release. Even if it meant paying the astronomical ransom demanded by Aceh, they had to demonstrate to their investors and their captains that they would not abandon their people. This set the stage for complex diplomatic negotiations where the balance of power, for the first time in the Dutch-Assanis relationship, lay firmly in the hands of the Sultanate, guided by Hayati. You reflect on the sheer scale of Hayati's achievement. At the time, she commanded her fleet and brought down Cornelis de Houtman. European women, particularly in the Calvinist Netherlands, faced extremely strict legal restrictions. They were subject to coverture, a legal doctrine where a woman's legal identity was subsumed by her husband upon marriage. She could not own property, sign contracts, or sue in court without her husband's permission. Yet here was a Javanese woman who was commanding a navy, seizing Dutch ships, and causing panic in the world's most advanced financial capital. The historical irony is immense. While Dutch women were legally invisible, Hayati was forcing the Dutch economy to its knees. The fate of global trade was literally being decided by a woman who the European legal system would have classified as property. The focus shifts back to the Malay archipelago, where Admiral Hayati is now deeply involved in the complex and protracted negotiations for the release of Frederick de Houtman. This wasn't a quick handover. It was a grueling diplomatic siege lasting over 2 years, and Hayati's influence was critical in securing terms that maximized Aceh's advantage. This period of negotiation is a crucial mainstream historical fact that highlights Hayati's transition into a high-level diplomat and policy advisor. The VOC, driven by the urgency of securing Frederick's release and the desperate need to restart stable trade, sent various envoys to Aceh. These negotiators often arrived with large gifts and promises, but they found the Aceh's court, advised by Hayati and the reigning sultan, completely unyielding. Hayati understood that every day Frederick remained captive. The ransom demanded was astronomical, consisting of a huge quantity of gold, specific valuable commodities like pepper, and, crucially, a guarantee of future trade under terms dictated by USET, not the VOC. The Acehs demanded that the Dutch formally apologize for their aggressive actions and guarantee safe passage for Aceh's ships trading with other ports, effectively forcing the VOC to recognize ASE's sovereignty. You can picture Hayati attending the court discussions, a formidable presence. While she may not have been the chief negotiator, her strategic input was undeniable. She knew the Dutch were primarily motivated by profit and reputation, and she advised the court to press the points that would hurt them the most: financial humiliation and a public acknowledgement of their defeat. This was about more than just Frederick's body. It was about humbling the VOC's corporate ego. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is that the VOC envoys were repeatedly forced to sail back to Batavia, the eventual Dutch headquarters, in Java, or even all the way back to Amsterdam for more funds or revised authorizations, stretching the negotiations over months. The Acehs, secure in their fortress and supply lines, were masters of strategic delay, wearing down the patience and draining the resources of the Dutch negotiators. The sheer size of the final ransom paid by the VOC was a major economic boost to the Sultanate. It was a clear, tangible victory that demonstrated to the entire region that resistance to European powers was not only possible, but profitable. The Acehs used this wealth to further modernize their fleet and fortify their defenses, ensuring they were ready for the inevitable future conflicts. Historians still argue whether the diplomatic victory was more humiliating for the VOC than the naval defeat. The fact that a powerful European entity was forced to pay tribute and make concessions to an Asian sovereign, satially one guided by a female admiral, was a blow to the European narrative of inevitable global domination. Frederick de Houtman was finally released in 1601 or 1602, having spent over 2 years in captivity. His release, achieved only on terms favorable to USA, solidified Hayati's position as a powerful political broker. Her strategic thinking ensured that the Acehs did not merely win a battle, but secured a long-term diplomatic and financial advantage. You realize the profound contrast in legal reality at play here. Frederick, a nobleman and major figure in a global corporation, had his fate decided by Hayati. At the same time, a woman in the Netherlands, even a wealthy merchant's wife, could not have independently concluded a business deal worth 1/10 of the ransom paid for Frederick. Nor could she legally control her own inheritance without a male guardian. The disparity in female legal agency between Isa and Europe in the early 17th century is stark, with Hayati operating in a realm of high-stakes power completely inaccessible to her female counterparts in Amsterdam or London. This successful negotiation was the final proof that Hayati was a master of both war and peace. With the Dutch crisis temporarily resolved through the massive ransom payment and Frederick de Houtman's release, Malahayati transitioned seamlessly from the battlefield commander to a key administrative and diplomatic figure within the Sultanate. You observe her now, not on a galley deck, but in the sophisticated port authority offices near the capital. This period highlights a crucial mainstream historical fact. Great military commanders often become essential state administrators, and Hayati was no exception. Her command was essential to the Inong Balee fleet, but her influence extended far beyond that. As admiral, she oversaw the massive port of Aceh, which involved complex logistical and bureaucratic responsibilities. This included supervising the collection of tariffs and customs. Duties the lifeblood of the Sultanate's wealth, managing the flow of international goods, and ensuring the smooth, continuous operation of the docks and shipyards. Imagine the complexity of this job. She had to manage relations with hundreds of different merchants, Indians, Persians, Arabs, Chinese, and the various Europeans age with different demands, currencies, and customs. Hayati would have been responsible for setting port regulations, adjudicating disputes between merchants and captains, and ensuring that the Sultanate's interests were always prioritized. This required a formidable grasp of international law, finance, and diplomacy, all skills she acquired through her rigorous early education. Her military authority gave her diplomatic weight. When foreign envoys arrived, whether from powerful Indian kingdoms or aggressive European companies, they had to deal with the person who had personally defeated the most recent major challenger. This reputation was a powerful tool in negotiations. She could use the threat of the Inong Balee to ensure compliance with Hassani's trade laws, making her effectively the ultimate arbiter of maritime commerce in the Sultanate. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is her potential involvement in the design or improvement of port infrastructure. Given her naval background, she would have understood the need for better dredging of channels, stronger fortifications, and more efficient loading and unloading mechanisms. It's highly likely that the increasing professionalism and security of the port of Aceh during this period was a direct result of her administrative oversight. She understood that a strong navy was useless if the port it protected was inefficient. Historians still argue whether Hayati's elevated role was purely due to her exceptional talent, or if the tradition of having women in high administrative and political positions was deeply rooted in the Assignist culture, specifically to maintain stability and neutrality among the often feuding male nobles. Regardless, she represented the apex of female administrative power in the region. Her diplomatic role was crucial in the ongoing struggle against the VOC. Hayati knew that Aceh could not afford to fight the Dutch alone. She was instrumental in maintaining or establishing ties with other maritime powers, ensuring that Aceh had alternative sources of trade and military supplies. She recognized the classic strategy of divide and conquer. In this case, divide and survive. You observe her directing subordinates, her commands concise and authoritative. She has to balance the need for revenue against the need for security. She must ensure that the port is inviting enough to attract trade, but secure enough to repel a surprise attack. She is managing an empire's economy from a desk, an incredible position of power when compared to her European counterparts. Remember how restricted European women were? Hayati's desk was the central switchboard for global commerce, controlling wealth and policy for a major world power. Her administrative phase proved that her talent was not limited to the adrenaline of battle, but extended to the quiet, complex art of governing. The success of her negotiations with the Dutch now opens the door for a very different kind of European interaction. The arrival of the English, the diplomatic landscape around Aceh constantly shifted, and with the Dutch temporarily chastened, the English decided it was time to test the waters. You are observing a new set of sails on the horizon belonging to the English East India Company, EIC. This transition from facing the aggressive Dutch to engaging with the more cautious English is a crucial diplomatic maneuver, and Admiral Hayati was central to it. The English arrival was personified by the respected merchant and privateer, Sir James Lancaster. Lancaster was an experienced mariner, keenly aware of the massive economic potential of the spice trade, but also critically aware of the recent brutal fate of Cornelis de Houtman. The demise of the Dutch expedition served as a stark, crucial mainstream historical fact that completely altered Lancaster's approach to Aceh. Lancaster arrived in 1602 with a more respectful and diplomatic demeanor, a stark contrast to the heavy-handed, coercive arrogance of de Houtman. He understood that Aceh was a sovereign power that could not be bullied, especially not by a force that had just seen a major European expedition destroyed by an Assanist admiral. His mission was to secure trading concessions, not through conquest, but through negotiation and mutual agreement. You observe the difference in their approach. Where de Houtman seized ships, Lancaster brought lavish gifts and letters of goodwill from Queen Elizabeth I. He sought an audience with the Sultan or Sultana, as the period transitions were frequent, and, inevitably, with the celebrated Admiral Malahayati. The English strategy was to secure a foothold by offering an alternative to the Dutch monopoly, and by implicitly offering military support against their common rival, the VOC. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is the particular focus of the English gifts. Knowing that Isa prized military power, Lancaster's envoys presented the court with gifts that included valuable weapons, heavy silver plate, and even English musicians to entertain the court. This was all calculated to show respect and technical parity, demonstrating that the English were not looking to dictate terms, but to establish an equitable alliance. Hayati's role in these negotiations was pivotal. She would have advised the Acehnese court that the English posed a much lower, more controllable threat than the Dutch, a wedge that could be used to further divide and weaken the VOC by granting favorable terms to the English. ESA could ensure a continued flow of vital European goods, like weapons and silver, while simultaneously creating a geopolitical rivalry that would keep the Dutch preoccupied. Historians still argue whether the English diplomacy was genuinely sincere, or if Lancaster's respectful approach was simply a temporary tactic, a calculated disguise to gain access to the spice markets before resorting to the same aggression as the VOC. Regardless of the intent, Hayati recognized the utility of the English presence for Aceh's long-term survival. You see the negotiation hall, perhaps within the Inong Balee fortress itself, underscoring Hayati's influence. She is present, a living reminder to Lancaster that the military reality of the situation favored the Acehnese. Lancaster, having studied the fate of his Dutch rival, treats the admiral with the utmost respect. He knows he is dealing with a seasoned strategist who is interested only in what benefits ESA. The result of these talks was the successful conclusion of the Anglo-Chinese Treaty of 1602. This treaty, guided by the strategic calculations of Admiral Hayati, was a triumph of Acehnese diplomacy. It secured favorable trading rights for the English, but guaranteed Acehnese sovereignty, and crucially, allowed ESE to continue trading with all other nations, directly undercutting the Dutch ambition for an exclusive monopoly. The stage is set for the finalization of this powerful alliance. The diplomatic efforts between Sir James Lancaster and the Acehnese court culminate in a landmark agreement. You are observing the signing of the Anglo-Chinese Treaty of 1602, a document that stands as a profound testament to Admiral Hayati's strategic acumen and ESS's sustained sovereignty. This treaty is a crucial mainstream historical fact, demonstrating Aceh's ability to successfully engage with European powers on equal and often superior terms. Hayati's influence permeated the terms of this agreement. She recognized that the English East India Company EIC was the lesser of two evils compared to the voracious VOC. The primary goal was not just securing English trade, but utilizing the English presence as a counterweight to Dutch aggression. The treaty granted the English permission to establish a trading post and engage in commerce, primarily for pepper, but always under strict Acehnese law and regulatory control. The most important clauses, which Hayati undoubtedly championed, were those that guaranteed Aceh's right to trade freely with all nations. This clause directly torpedoed the VOC's core objective, a complete monopoly. By allowing a major competitor like the EIC to operate, Hayati ensured that the Dutch could never fully choke off Acehnese trade, thereby securing a steady source of revenue and military supplies for the Sultanate. The treaty also included provisions for mutual defense against Portuguese aggression, an open gesture of alliance against a common historical foe. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is the contrast between the treaty's physical formality and its underlying power dynamic. The English envoys, representing the Crown of England, were forced to adhere to strict Acehnese court protocol, including elaborate bows and ceremonial exchanges. A clear symbolic acknowledgement that they were visitors on the Sultan's terms, not conquerors dictating policy. This formal deference was a crucial political victory for Hayati and the court. If you can imagine the English captains, who were accustomed to bullying smaller states, being forced to deal respectfully with Hayati the admiral. She was the one who controlled the naval might that could destroy them, a fact Lancaster, having witnessed the fate of the Dutch, never forgot. She had successfully leveraged military might into diplomatic advantage, ensuring that the EIC's foothold was dependent entirely on their good behavior and adherence to the treaty. Historians still argue whether the 1602 treaty truly benefited the English in the long run, as the strict Assignats terms hampered the EIC's profitability compared to the VOC's later, more ruthless acquisitions elsewhere. However, for ESA, it was an undeniable success, ensuring a period of peace with one major European power and securing an ally against the other. The treaty also had a significant impact on Haiti's internal political standing. It solidified her role as the state's foremost military and diplomatic strategist. Her decision to cultivate a relationship with the English, who were then emerging as a major naval power, proved her foresight in balancing regional threats. She was successfully implementing the Agayod strategy of using one enemy to check the ambitions of another, thereby creating a buffer zone for Asanas independence. You think back to the restrictions on women in European society. Here, an Asian woman was directly responsible for a major international trade agreement that shaped the course of European competition in the East. She dictated terms to envoys carrying the seal of the English monarch, securing trade routes and military alliances for her sovereign state. This power, derived from her command of the Inong Balee fleet and her strategic genius, is the defining image of her political authority. The treaty was a masterpiece of geopolitical maneuvering, ensuring that, for the time being, Asa's future remained firmly in Assignats' hands, thanks in large part to the woman who defeated the Dutch. You are now walking through the ultimate manifestation of Malahayati's power and dedication, the fortress Inong Balee itself. This was not just a military base. It was the nerve center of her command, the barracks, the armory, and the strategic heart of the Sultanate's naval defense. This formidable complex is a crucial mainstream historical fact, representing a unique social and military structure. The fortress, often located strategically on a defensible headland or large island near the capital, was designed to be self-sufficient and nearly impregnable from a naval attack. You observe the massive, thick stone walls, specifically constructed to resist the heavy cannon fire of European galleons. The design would have incorporated lessons learned from years of fighting the Portuguese, utilizing high ramparts and angled bastions to provide overlapping fields of fire. Within the fortress walls, the daily life of the Inong Balee was one of intense, organized professionalism. You can see the dedicated training yards where the women practiced musketry and cannon loading. The logistics were intricate. Massive storehouses were filled with rice, water, and most importantly, gunpowder and cannonballs. Hayati oversaw the meticulous maintenance of the arsenal, ensuring that every musket was clean and every cannon was ready to fire at a moment's notice. The fortress also housed the shipyards and dry docks necessary for the continuous repair and maintenance of the fleet. The women of the Inong Balee were skilled artisans, not just warriors. They included sailmakers, riggers, carpenters, and even metalsmiths who repaired and cast smaller cannons. This self-reliance made the fortress an operational hub that was incredibly difficult to disable, as it didn't need external male support for its functionality. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is the strict social code and sense of community within the fortress. Having all suffered the loss of their husbands or relatives to European aggression, the women formed a profoundly close-knit community bound by a shared vow of vengeance and defense. This environment, exclusively dedicated to military training and service, created a level of focus and morale that was virtually unmatched by any contemporary military force, European or Asian. They were not fighting for a paycheck. They were fighting for survival and honor. Historians still argue whether the Inong Balee was an entirely permanent institution, with women staying on after their combat years to fill support roles, or if it was predominantly a combat-oriented unit whose members retired to civilian life later. What is clear is that the fortress complex provided not only military security, but also social security for these widows, giving them status, income, and purpose. You walk through the barracks, which are disciplined and clean, a testament to the rigorous standards of Admiral Malahayati. The fortress was the physical embodiment of her vision, a powerful, professional military force, led and operated by women, dedicated to the preservation of Asanas independence. The entire operation was a seamless blend of military strategy, logistics, and social welfare. The location also served as Hayati's primary command post for intelligence gathering. From the battlements, signals could be sent directly to the Sultan's palace, and reconnaissance reports from patrolling galleys could be analyzed immediately. When European envoys like Sir James Lancaster were invited to the area, the sheer scale and order of the Inong Balee fortress must have served as a powerful, silent diplomatic message. This is the power you risk provoking. Contrast this complex with the status of women in contemporary Europe. In London or Paris, a widow's fate was precarious, often reliant on the tenuous charity of relatives or the terms of a will. She certainly couldn't command a fortress, control a budget, or decide the fate of nations. Hayati, operating from the physical security of her great fortress, held more concrete, legal, financial, and military power than virtually any non-royal woman in the world at that time. This fortress, built by the Assanis and commanded by Hayati, was the ultimate symbol of that power disparity. This section brings us to the core historical irony of Malahayati's life, requiring you to pause and draw a stark comparison between her immense power in USA and the absolute legal powerlessness of women in 17th century Europe. This juxtaposition is the defining element of her hidden story. In Isa, Hayati was the Laksamana admiral. She commanded a formidable fleet, dictated terms to global corporations like the VOC, signed international treaties with powers like the EIC, controlled strategic fortresses, and managed the economic flow of a major world port. Her authority was not derived from her husband, who was dead, or a male proxy. It was vested in her directly by the Sultanate based on her merit and lineage. This level of power and legal autonomy is a crucial mainstream historical fact for the history of Southeast Asia. Now, shift your gaze across the ocean to contemporary Europe, specifically the Netherlands or England, the very nations whose ships Hayati was sinking. The legal reality for women there was governed by a doctrine known as coverture. You are looking at a 17th century English or Dutch law text. This is a cold, hard fact. Under coverture, when a woman married, her legal identity was entirely absorbed by her husband. She ceased to be a separate legal person. Consider the ramifications. Property ownership. An English or Dutch married woman could not legally own property in her own name. Any land, inherited wealth, or even the wages she earned immediately became the property of her husband. Contracts, she could not sign contracts, engage in lawsuits, or make substantial financial decisions without her husband's explicit permission. If she entered into a contract, it was legally void. Wills and inheritance. She could rarely execute a will independently and had extremely limited control over the inheritance of her own children. Her financial life was completely governed by her male spouse or nearest male relative. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is that in some English legal circles at the time, women were literally categorized alongside children and people of unsound mind, those incapable of exercising independent legal judgment. They were seen as perpetual dependents. Historians still argue whether the legal status of European women was deliberately kept low to stabilize inheritance lines among the elite, or if it was a reflection of deeper theological and cultural beliefs about female inferiority. Regardless of the cause, the effect was crippling legal dependency. The irony is breathtaking. The VOCA company, financed by Dutch citizens, many of whom had wives who couldn't legally buy a loaf of bread on credit, was forced to pay millions in ransom negotiated and dictated in part by Admiral Hayati, who, if she had been born a Dutch wife, would not have been legally permitted to possess the gold itself, let alone command the power to acquire it. She was simultaneously an international policymaker and, according to the legal systems of her enemies, someone who possessed the legal rights of a minor child. You realize that Hayati's story is so often hidden in Western history because it fundamentally challenges the Eurocentric narrative of inevitable European superiority and the assumed modernity of their societal structures. Her life demonstrates that in the critical areas of commerce, military strategy, and female empowerment, certain Asian societies in the 17th century were far more advanced, or at least offered opportunities for female leadership that were simply unimaginable in London, Paris, or Amsterdam. You contemplate the sheer audacity of this reality. A woman in Aceh used cannons and diplomacy to command naval supremacy and wealth. A woman in Europe, at the same time, needed her husband's signature just to sell a chicken. This comparison is the powerful underlying theme that makes Hayati's story essential. It reveals that power, opportunity, and agency are not universal constants, but are contingent upon the culture and circumstances in which one is born. Hayati was not an exception to her society's rules. She was an exceptional leader, enabled by a society that, for all its own constraints, recognized talent and necessity above gender in matters of state survival. The intense years of naval command, the crushing defeat of the Dutch, and the successful diplomatic negotiations eventually led Admiral Hayati into a period of more focused political and advisory roles. You follow her life past the active fighting years, as she transitions from the deck of her flagship to the inner circles of the Javanese court. This later life is just as significant as her battles, cementing her legacy as a pillar of the Sultanate. While the exact year of her retirement from active naval command is not definitively documented, her influence continued unabated well into the 17th century, especially under the reign of the first female Sultan Sultana Safiatuddin. This continued role as a trusted advisor to the throne is a crucial mainstream historical fact. She provided continuity, institutional memory, and invaluable strategic counsel to the new generation of rulers. Hayati's later focus would have been on long-term defense planning and infrastructure development. You can imagine her reviewing plans for new fortifications, advising on the latest developments in European gunpowder technology, which was constantly evolving, and strategizing on how to maintain the naval balance of power in the strait. Her expertise was a priceless state asset. She was essentially the Secretary of Defense, Minister of Trade, and Chief of Naval Operations all rolled into one, even if the formal titles shifted. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is the historical accounts that suggest Hayati maintained her command presence even in her advisory role. Visiting foreign envoys, whether from Siam or the Netherlands, were still often introduced to the famous Laksamana and were acutely aware of the power she wielded behind the scenes. Her reputation alone was a form of diplomatic deterrence. She was the ghost of the battlefield, reminding everyone of the catastrophic consequences of arrogance. Historians still argue whether Hayati's personal influence was the primary driver that led to the subsequent era of the 4 female sultans in USA, or if she was simply a brilliant product of a social system that was already predisposed to accept capable female leadership during times of crisis. Regardless, her existence and power made the idea of a female sovereign not only acceptable but desirable to many factions within the Javanese court, as she had demonstrated that women could in fact lead the state through its greatest military and political challenges. She would have spent considerable time at the Inong Balee fortress, overseeing the training and mentoring the next generation of commanders. The fortress was not only a military base, but also a repository of military knowledge, a naval college where the hard-won lessons of the battles against the Portuguese and the Dutch were codified and taught. You observe her in her final years, a figure of profound respect, a national legend in her own time. She was a living symbol of Asinus, independence, and resistance against foreign corporate greed. Her legacy was not just a list of victories, it was the continued sovereignty of Aceh itself, which managed to hold off full-scale European colonization for far longer than many neighboring states. The sheer scale of her achievement remains staggering. She lived long enough to see the first major European powers recognize her nation's strength. She had avenged her husband, secured her country's economic future, and, perhaps most profoundly, demonstrated an unparalleled example of female command and state leadership at a time when women elsewhere were constrained by law, not by competence. Her passing, which likely occurred later in the 17th century, would have been a national event, marking the end of the foundational era of Asinus' maritime power and the passing of its greatest naval commander. Despite her monumental achievements, defeating a major European expedition, securing a critical hostage, and negotiating favorable international treaties, Malahayati's story remains relatively obscure in general Western history texts. You are now exploring the reasons for this historical silence and the contemporary efforts to finally place her in the global pantheon of great leaders. The obscurity of her life outside of Southeast Asia is a crucial mainstream historical fact, illustrating how narratives of global power are often filtered through a Eurocentric lens that downplays or ignores Asian success. For centuries, the history of the spice trade was told almost exclusively from the perspective of the Portuguese and the Dutch. Focusing on their struggles, their discoveries, and their eventual triumphs, conveniently omitting the powerful local resistance they faced, particularly when that resistance was led by a woman. It's hard to sell a narrative of European dominance when the first major VOC expedition was annihilated by a female admiral. the process of rediscovery and recognition gained significant momentum in the 20th and 21st centuries. In Indonesia, particularly in her home province of Aceh, Hayati has always been a figure of immense local pride and legendary status. However, national recognition formalized her legacy. You see the documentation from the Indonesian government declaring her a national heroine of Indonesia. Pahlawan Nasional in 2017. This official designation is a powerful affirmation of her importance and has sparked renewed scholarly interest and public education about her life and achievements. A fascinating, quirky tidbit is how her name is now used across modern Indonesia. You can find everything from naval training ships to major universities and even street names dedicated to Malahayati. This widespread cultural commemoration ensures that, regardless of what's written in Western history books, her legacy is constantly woven into the fabric of modern Indonesian identity, particularly as a symbol of maritime strength and female leadership. Historians still argue whether the silence about Hayati was an active, deliberate campaign by European powers to suppress evidence of their defeat, or if it was simply a passive consequence of colonial history prioritizing sources written by European agents over the rich, complex local chronicles. Regardless of intent, the result was the same: a profound historical injustice. The modern relevance of Hayati's story extends beyond the correction of historical record. She is a potent symbol for contemporary discussions about gender, leadership, and post-colonial identity. She provides a historical template for a European female commander who successfully navigated the complex politics of early globalization. She demonstrates that strategic genius is not confined by gender or geography. You look at the ongoing scholarly work, the translation of Asanis and other Malay language chronicles, and the renewed archaeological interest in the sites associated with the Inong Balee fortress. These efforts are slowly pulling her story out of the shadows and into the global spotlight it deserves. Her victory over Cornelis de Houtman is increasingly taught in maritime history courses worldwide as a key example of effective asymmetric naval resistance. Against a technologically superior foe, you think back to the stark comparison of legal rights. Hayati's rediscovery is a powerful reminder that while the Western world prides itself on linear progress, pockets of power and agency existed elsewhere, sometimes in more advanced forms. She is proof that during the period when European women were struggling for the right to control their dowries, an Asanis woman was commanding fleets and securing the economic future of a sovereign nation. This final recognition of her status is not just about correcting the past, it's about reshaping the way we understand the power dynamics and societal advancements of the 17th century world. The silence is finally being broken, and the full weight of her legacy is beginning to be felt globally. We reach the final contemplation of Malahayati's story, reflecting not just on the events of her life, but on the enduring power and sheer audacity of her achievements. You stand back from the historical details, allowing the full weight of her legacy to settle upon you. She was the Javanese queen, or high-ranking noblewoman, admiral depending on the fluid titles of the era, who achieved what was utterly unimaginable for her female contemporaries in the powerful capitals of Europe. She didn't just inherit a title, she earned command through rigorous military education, strategic planning, and successful combat against the best navies the Western world could field. This is the profound takeaway, the single unassailable fact of her historical presence. Her story forces us to challenge the persistent myth of linear, Eurocentric progress. How could a woman operating in a 17th century Asian sultanate wield more sovereign, military, and economic power than virtually any woman in the so-called advanced societies of Europe? The answer lies in the pragmatic genius of her own culture, which prioritized competence and survival, and her own towering personal ambition and skill. She turned personal grief into professional power, successfully mobilizing a revolutionary fighting force, the Inong Balee, that became the cornerstone of her nation's defense. You recall the dramatic confrontation, the arrogant Cornelis de Houtman sailing in confident of an easy victory, only to meet his end at the hands of a commander whose strategic thinking he had entirely failed to calculate. The death of de Houtman and the resulting panic in Amsterdam serve as a permanent historical marker. Asian sovereignty, under exceptional female leadership, was able to halt and humiliate the world's most aggressive corporate power. Historians still argue whether the Laksamana would have had the same impact if the circumstances, the death of her husband, the Dutch aggression, the era of female-friendly succession, hadn't perfectly aligned for her. What remains undeniable is that when the opportunity presented itself, Hayati possessed the necessary skills forged through years of training, an experience to seize control and dictate the future of her state. The historical silence surrounding her legacy, now being rectified, teaches us a crucial lesson about power and narrative. History is often written by the victors, or, in this case, by the powers that eventually achieved global dominance. Hayati's story was suppressed because it provided undeniable proof that European superiority in the 17th century was a fragile, localized myth. Easily shattered by organized, strategic resistance from the East, she was a threat to the narrative of colonialism itself. Her life is a commitment to the sea, a story that began in the aristocratic compounds of USA and ended with her as a legend of the waves, a symbol of freedom and resilience. The tide of the 17th century is slowly receding now, pulling you away from the humid air of ESA and the scent of gunpowder and spices. As the light fades over the Malacca Strait, you can almost hear the soft, distant rhythm of the Inong Balee war drums, a faint echo of the formidable fleet commanded by the woman who refused to let her nation bend its knee to corporate greed. Malahayati, the admiral, her legacy is etched, not just in the stone of her fortress, but in the enduring spirit of sovereignty and resistance. Allow the images of the fierce galleys and the unyielding fortress walls to soften, transforming into the calmness of memory. The turbulent waters of history settle, leaving behind the quiet conviction that some of the greatest heroes are those whose stories take the longest to find the light. The battle is over, the lesson is learned. Find peace in the knowledge that tonight you have helped recall one of history's greatest and most hidden commands. Let the silence descend, just breathe.